Ang natapos nyo is hanggang financial liabilities. Is that correct? Or hanggang saan po yung natapos ninyo?
Yes po, sir. Financial liabilities po.
Oh, I see. So, financial liabilities. Pero introduction lang siya or diniscuss niya na in details lahat ng klase ng financial liabilities? So, I mean to say, na-discuss na in full ni Ma'am Tuazon yung financial liabilities?
Sir, yung mga last, parang yung last po, medyo mabilisan na lang po since last na po yung meeting.
Okay. So, mabilisan na lang. Okay. Siguro, let's just have a recapitulation of what you've discussed together with Ma'am Tuazon regarding financial liabilities. So let's start siguro, no? Kwentuhan lang naman tayo ngayon. So wala pa tayong computation, kwentuhan lang kung paano gumagalaw si financial liabilities. But before we discuss about financial liabilities, maybe we can discuss first about financial assets. So recap lang tayo ng financial assets. So okay lang ba mag-present ako sa inyo?
Yes po, sir.
Okay lang po.
All right. So let me just check. Okay. Okay. Can you now see my screen, class?
Yes po.
Yes.
All right. So it's an Excel, right?
Yes po.
All right. So ano bang sabi ni financial asset? Ano daw definition ng financial asset? So kwentuhan lang tayo. Si financial asset, diniscuss siya ni IAS 32. So siya yung nag-define kay financial asset. So ano bang sabi ni IAS 32 kay financial asset? A financial asset is any financial instrument that is recap lang tayo. So pwede po magsalita kung may idea po kayo about financial asset. If you want to recite, you can just click the raise hand button so I may know kung gusto nyo mag-recite. And then if kung nahihiya kayo, you can just send your answers through our chat box para mabasa rin natin yung gusto nyo isagot. So anong sabi ni IAS 32? A financial asset is any financial instrument that is a cash, ano pa? An equity instrument of another entity. Ano pa po? I think Charles is raising his hand.
Try po, sir.
Yes po.
A contractual right or to receive cash or another financial asset.
Yes, that's correct. It is a contractual right to receive cash or another financial asset from another entity. So ano pa po? Anyone? I think Christelle is raising her hand as well. Any other from the class? Yes, Charles.
A contract will or a may be settled in the entity's own equity instrument.
So it is a contractual right to receive cash or another financial asset from another entity, or ano pa po yung isa? I'm so sorry again, Charles. Ano pa po yung sinabi mo na isa?
A contract will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instrument or ano po, derivatives po.
So, yes, through the use of equity's own shares, di ba? Entity's own equity instrument. So, kapag sinettle siya using the entity's own equity instrument, it could be a non-derivative financial instrument or a derivative financial instrument. So pag sinabing derivative financial instrument, it came from the word derive. So pag sinabing derive, ano yung ibig sabihin kapag sinabing derive? When you read or heard the word derive, anong ibig sabihin?
Nakuha or galing.
Yes, pag sinabing gano'n. Okay, I think John Jericho is raising his hand.
Sir, to obtain something from po.
To obtain something from. So lumalabas. So tama po yun. And then I think Marian said nakuha. So tama po yun pareho ng terminology. So pag sinabing derive, to obtain something from another thing. So lumalabas, ang derivative financial asset pala ay nanggaling sa isa pang financial asset. So meron kang financial asset which is equity instrument. So itong equity instrument mo na yan, yung equity instrument mo na yan, nag-derive pa siya, nanganak pa siya ng isa pang financial instrument. So ang tawag doon, derivative financial instrument. Nagigets po ba? Nakukuha po ba, class? Can you still hear me, class?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Yes po, sir.
Alright. So, can you give me example of a derivative financial instrument? Or is it your first time to hear the word derivative financial instrument? Again, class, can you still hear me, class?
Yes po.
All right. So, again, na-encounter niyo na po ba yung derivative financial instruments before, or is it your first time? So, about derivative. First time. Okay. So,
First time po.
Okay. So, first time. So, pagkwentuhan natin about yung derivative financial instrument. So, pag sinabing derivative financial instrument, it is a financial instrument that derived from another financial instrument. So, pag nag-derive siya from another financial instrument, we're not so sure kung yung na-derive ba na yon will arise to a financial asset or a financial liability. Pwedeng may financial asset ka, tapos meron siyang embedded derivative, pero hindi natin alam kung yung naka-embed na derivative doon ay financial asset rin ba or a financial liability. So, ganun po yun. So, pag may naka-embed, it's a derivative financial instrument. Pero we're not so sure if it's a financial asset or a financial liability. That's why we need to check kung yung naka-derive po ba na nandoon na financial instrument ay isang financial asset or financial liability. So, ganun po yung process ng pag-identify ng mga derivative financial instrument. So, normally yung mga derivative financial instrument, yung example nito, nasa ano siya, mga forward contracts. Sorry. Normally, mga forward contracts po yun. So, mga forward contracts, ano pa? Options, contracts, put contracts. Yan yung mga example ng mga derivative financial instruments. So may forward contracts, option contracts, put contracts. So sila yung mga example ng mga derivative financial instruments. Meron pang isang example. So ano po example yun? It's a rainfall. Rainfall contract. So itong mga contracts na to, normally ginagamit ito sa mga foreign currency transactions. So kapag nakikipagkontrata sila with another entity outside the Philippines, syempre meron kasi yung foreign currency exposure. Minsan kapag may foreign currency exposure, hindi nila alam kung in the future ba mas malaki yung kanilang babayaran. So one example, for example, si Entity 1, siya yung buyer. Entity 1, siya yung buyer. And then Entity 2, siya yung seller. So, ano yung binibenta ni seller kay buyer? Bumili siya ng equipment. So, magkano yung halaga ng equipment niya? That's 100,000 pesos. $100,000. So, magkano ang palitan ng $100,000 nung time na binili niya yan? Sabihin natin, that's 45 pesos to $1. To $1 US. So, magkano yung dapat niyang ilabas na peso para matapatan yung $100,000? Kasi magbabayad siya ng $100,000. So, magkano yung dapat niyang bayaran? Anyone from the class?
4.5 million.
4.5 million. So, tama. Tama. And then, I think RJ said also 4.5 million. So nung time na pinurchase niya, so ito yung purchase date. Nung time na pinurchase niya yung equipment, the value at the exchange rate at that time is 45 pesos is to $1. So magkano yung kanyang babayaran? Dapat 4.5 million pesos. Kaso, nung babayaran niya na, nung payment date, umabot na ng 55 pesos is to $1. So magkano yung kanyang ilalabas na pera kapag magbabayad na siya? 5,500,000 pesos. So see the difference? Magkano yung kanyang additional na babayaran? 1 million pesos ang kanyang additional na babayaran. Magkano lang yung value ng equipment nung binili niya? 4.5 million pesos. Pero nung magbabayad na siya, magkano na ang palitan? Nadagdagan ng magkano? 10 piso bawat US dollar. So itong 1 million na additional yung babayaran, masaya ba siya or malungkot? Kung ikaw yung buyer.
Malungkot po.
Malungkot. Kasi you are paying, di ba malungkot? Kasi you are paying for the equipment with 100,000 value. At that time, 45 pesos ang palitan. Pero nung binayaran mo na, 55 pesos na. So magbabayad ka ng 1 million pesos additional. So para maiwasan yung additional foreign exchange loss, nakikipag-enter into agreement yung buyer into a better. So yung better na yon, nagbibigay siya ng contracts. So mga example ng derivative contracts are forwards, futures, options, swaps, put contracts, rainfall contracts. So kapag nakipag-engage sila with these contracts, pwede nila ma-minimize ito, babayaran nilang additional cost sa equipment at the payment date. Nagigets po ba? Nagigets po ba, class?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Alright. So normally, ganun yung mga derivative contracts, yung laro ng derivative contracts sa market. Yung mga non-derivatives naman, these are financial instruments na walang derivative financial instruments. So they are purely financial instruments na walang anak. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Yes po.
So ulit, financial asset is any financial instrument that is cash, equity instrument of another entity. So just like stocks offered in the Philippine Stock Exchange. And then ikatlo, contractual right to receive cash or another financial instrument from another entity, or if there is an exchange of financial assets or financial liabilities with condition that is favorable to the entity. So kapag ang na-receive mong financial asset favorable pala sa side mo, lumalabas financial asset 'yon. Kapag ang na-receive mo na financial instrument unfavorable sa side mo, financial liability pala 'yon. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba? So, ang financial instrument, it depends on the favorability and unfavorability on your part. Kung favorable siya sa iyo, makaka-receive ka ng cash, makaka-receive ka ng another financial instrument, then that's a financial asset. But if it's unfavorable on your part, kapag kapag meron kang financial instrument, but in the future, dapat kang maglabas ng cash or dapat kang maglabas ulit ng another financial instrument, then that is a financial liability. That's a financial instrument with a financial liability. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba, class?
Yes po, sir.
Alright. So, magbigay tayo ng example. Si Entity 1 saka si Entity 2, meron silang promissory note. So, Entity 1, Entity 2,
Yes.
merong promissory note. So, ang nag-issue, sino ang nag-issue? Si Entity 2. Siya yung issuer. While yung pinag-issue 1, si Entity 1. Nag-issue ng promissory note? Nag-issue ng promissory note, class?
Entity 2.
Entity 2.
Entity 2. So, lumalabas, siya yung gumawa ng promissory note kasi siya yung issuer, di ba? Tama po ba ako?
Opo.
Alright. So, kung siya yung nag-issue, will that financial instrument be favorable or unfavorable on Entity 2's part? Favorable ba yun sa kanya or unfavorable? Isipin na maigi, class. Will that be favorable or unfavorable?
Unfavorable.
Unfavorable. So if it's unfavorable, then that is a
Unfavorable.
financial liability on the part of Entity 2. At kung sino yung pinag-issue 1, favorable naman yung sa part niya. So that is considered as a financial asset. Nakukuha po ba?
Yes
Opo.
po.
Yes po.
Alright.
Yes po.
So, if it's a financial liability on the part of the issuer, then ano yung dapat niyang i-record? Notes,
Payable po.
and then if it's a financial asset on the part of entity 1, ano yung dapat niyang i-record? Notes,
Receivable po.
receivable.
Notes receivable po.
Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Yes po.
So, kapag dumating yung due date, kapag dumating ang due date, anong marireceive ni entity 1? Kapag dumating yung due date,
Cash po.
may marireceive siyang cash. Tama po ba?
Cash
May
po.
marireceive siyang cash. So, kapag may na-receive siyang cash, it agrees with the definition of IAS 32 about financial asset. Ano sabi ni IAS 22? Financial asset is any financial instrument with a contractual right to receive cash. Diba? Tama po ba? Contractual right to receive cash or another financial asset. So, naka-receive siya ng cash. Diba? So, anong nangyari? Kung naka-receive siya ng cash, then mawawala na si promissory note. Tama po ba? So, mawawala na si promissory note. Kapag nawala na si promissory note, then the transaction means it is settled. Pag na-settle na yung transaction, lumalabas si notes receivable sa part ni entity 1, wala na. Sa part ni entity 2, wala na din. So both recorded notes receivable and notes payable, wala na sa parehong entity. Kasi naka-receive na ng cash si entity 1. Kasi dumating na yung due date. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba, class?
Opo.
Yes po.
Yes po.
Yes po.
Po.
All right. So any more question, class? Any more question? Another thing, meron tayong purchase transaction. Bumili ng anong binili niya ni entity 1? Mag-isip kayo kung anong gusto mong binili ni entity 1 kay entity 2.
Land.
Bumili ng
Supplies po.
sige, sabihin natin supplies. Bumili ng supplies si entity 1. Lumalabas si entity 1 yung buyer. Tapos, sino yung seller? Si entity 2. Kung ang binili ni entity 1 ay supplies. So, ano natanggap ni entity 1? Ano yung natanggap ni entity 1?
Material.
Supply.
Supplies.
Supply.
So, yung binili niya, di ba? Yan yung mga bagay na hindi kailangan pag-isipan na. Kasi, ayun yung kanyang binili. So, supplies. And then, ano yung natanggap ni entity 2? Sabihin natin yung purchase transaction
Cash po.
has a credit terms. Sabihin natin may credit terms siya. Ipapautang siya.
Accounts
May credit.
receivable.
So, meron siyang
Accounts
Accounts
payable.
receivable po.
accounts receivable, di ba?
Receivable.
So, may natanggap na accounts receivable si entity 2, may natanggap na supplies si entity 1, di ba? Tama po ba?
Opo.
Yes. Upon
Yes
receiving
po.
supplies, since
Yes po.
wala pa siyang nilabas na cash, ano yung dapat niyang i-record na related account?
Accounts
Accounts.
payable.
Accounts payable.
Payable po.
So, naka-receive siya ng accounts, ng supplies. Tapos meron siyang accounts payable na record. And then C, entity 2, may accounts receivable through sales. Kasi nagbenta siya. Nakuha po ba? So, accounts payable sa part ni entity 1, yung accounts payable sa part ni entity 1, it is a financial instrument. While yung accounts receivable sa part ni entity 2, that is a financial instrument. Dumating yung due date. Magbabayad na dapat si buyer. Tama po ba? Kapag dumating ang due date, magbabayad na dapat si buyer?
Yes po.
Yes.
Yes po.
Kaso
Yes
wala
po.
pang pambayad si buyer. Nag-issue siya ng promissory note. So, nung nag-issue siya ng promissory note, ano nangyari? Magre-record siya ng notes.
Notes payable po.
Payable.
Payable.
Notes payable po.
So, nag-record siya ng notes payable, and then, si seller naman, magre-record
Notes
ng
receivable.
notes receivable.
Receivable.
What's the first transaction settled? Na-settle ba yung first transaction?
Yes po.
Yes. Na-settled yung first transaction because the accounts payable is
Naging notes.
already settled. Dahil lagi siyang notes payable. Nakukuha po ba? And then yung notes receivable, yung accounts receivable is also settled. Kasi nagkaroon siya ng notes receivable. So nag-agree ba ito with the definition of financial asset as per IAS 32? You have the contractual right to receive cash or another financial asset from another entity. Noong una, meron siyang accounts receivable, which is a financial instrument. Meron siyang contractual right to receive cash. Pero nung dumating yung due date, hindi siya naka-receive ng cash. Ano yung na-receive niya? Another financial instrument, which is notes receivable. Nagigets po ba, class?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Alright.
Yes po.
Yes po.
Okay. So I don't think you have more questions regarding financial asset. May question pa po ba tayo regarding financial asset?
Wala na po.
Wala na po. So if you don't have any more questions with financial asset, then we go now with financial liability. So financial liability, before we discuss financial liability, let's discuss first the terminology of the word liability. So ano ba yung accounting definition ng liability? Feeling ko napag-aralan nyo naman na to. So that is based on
Obligation.
conceptual framework of accounting, di ba? So, si conceptual framework of accounting, siya yung nag-define nung term na liability. So, what is liability as based on conceptual framework?
Present obligations of an entity.
Present obligation.
So, it is a present obligation of an entity arising from past transactions or events. Ano pa sabi ni conceptual framework? Settlement is expected to result in an outflow from the entity. So ano yung una niya sinabi? It is a present obligation. Nung entity, saan ang galing? Sa past transactions or event. Dahil meron siyang ginawa na transaksyon nung mga nakaraang araw or nung nakaraang panahon, kasi yung lumipas na segundo, that is already considered a past transaction. So kung meron kang ginawa sa past transaction mo that arise to a present obligation, it could be a liability. Pero yung present obligation na yon, ano sabi? It should be settled and expected to result in an outflow from the entity. Ano pa yung sinabi ng conceptual framework? Outflow from the entity must be resources embodying economic benefits. So, pag sinabing outflow, ano po yung outflow?
Daloy palabas.
Disbursement.
Pag sinabing outflow, lumabas, di ba? May paglalabas no isang resources, di ba? So, it's not exactly a disbursement. Pero merong lalabas na
Asset.
resources. Nakuha po ba? When we say resources, anong ibig sabihin nun? Di ba napag-aralan natin yung conceptual framework? Pag sinabing resources, ano pong ibig sabihin nun?
Asset. Supply.
Assets. Nakukuha po ba? Resources is equal to assets. Nakukuha po ba? Naalala pa po ba yon? Naalala pa po ba yun? Yes. Kasi paano yon? Paano nasabing asset yon? Kasi resources is equal to sources. Resources is equal to sources. Ayusin natin habang maganda yung yan. So, resources is equal to sources. At yung resources, anong sabi? Resources daw is equal to assets. While yung sources, ito yung pinanggalingan ng resources. Ano ba yung mga sources ng assets? Liabilities, saka owners,
Equity.
equity. So, assets is equal to liabilities plus owner's equity. At the same time, resources is equal to sources. So, lumalabas, resources, yun yung assets. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Yes
po. Yes po.
Sige, balik tayo doon sa transaction sa itaas. Si Entity 1, saka si Entity 2. Anong inisyu ni Entity 2? Promissory note. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets
Yes
po ba?
Yes po.
Nag-issue siya ng promissory note, so
Yes,
lumalabas yung financial liability na record ni Entity 2. And then financial asset kay Entity 1. Dumating yung due date, ano nangyari? Nagbayad si Entity 1 ng cash. Tama po ba? Nagbayad si Entity
Yes
1
po.
ng cash. So the first transaction is considered as settled. Nawala na yung notes payable, nawala yung notes receivable. So yung cash na yon sa part ni Entity 1, that is a cash inflow. Ka-receive kasi si Entity 1, di ba? Pero sino nagbayad? Si Entity 2. So that is a cash outflow.
Outflow.
So that is considered a cash outflow on the part of Entity 2. So nagtugma ba siya doon sa definition ng liability? As per conceptual framework, it is a
Yes
present
po.
obligation. Present obligation ba yung kanyang promissory note? Present obligation po ba yon?
Yes
Yes
po.
po.
Yes.
Yes po.
Nag-arise ba yon sa past transaction?
Yes din.
Yes po.
Yes. Settlement. Na-settle po ba?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Yes. Is
Yes po.
expected to result in an outflow from the entity. Meron po bang outflow? Cash outflow.
Yes po. Meron.
Yes
Yes.
po.
Ano daw yung outflow na yun? Resources embodying economic benefits. So cash, is it an asset? Is it an asset in cash?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Yes. So tugmang-tugma yung definition ng liability sa transaction na ginawa ni Entity 2. So dapat lang siya mag-recognize ng financial liability. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Opo, sir.
Yes po, sir.
So let's go now again with present obligation. So pag sinabing present obligation, ano po yun? Pag sinabing present obligation, ano po yun, class?
Current liabilities.
Present obligation arises from two obligations, two kinds of obligations. First one is coming from legal obligation. Ikalawa naman is constructive obligation. Diba? So, pag sinabing legal obligation, that came from law or contract. Pag law, statutory obligation. Pag contract, contractual obligation. And then other one is from constructive obligation. So pag sinabing constructive obligation, it came from the normal business practice. So ano yung mga example no legal obligation natin? One example is salaries payable. So, salaries payable, bakit kaya naging legal obligation siya? Kasi meron tayong tinatawag na labor code. So, that is a statutory obligation. And then, merong employment contract na nag-exist between employers saka employees. So that's why salaries payable is considered a legal obligation. Well, yung example ng constructive obligation is yung unearned revenues. Unearned revenues. So bakit naging constructive obligation yung unearned revenues? Anyone from the class? Anyone from the class? Kailangan natin itong pag-aralan before we discuss further the financial liability.
Try lang po, sir.
Yes, Maria. Sige po.
Since ang unearned revenues po is result from normal business practice, naging liabilities po siya kasi may obligation pa po tayo na it's either product or services from dun po sa wait. Di ba po, naging liability siya kasi may obligation pa po tayo na kailangan nating i-render yung service or ibigay yung product. But yung payment is nasa atin na. That's why it's constructive obligation.
That's correct. That's correct po. Because we receive the cash in advance. Tama po ba? We receive the cash, the payment in advance. Lumalabas, yung pera, yung full payment, nasa atin na. Kaso, ang question doon, na-earn na ba natin fully yung income? Na-earn na po ba natin fully yung income?
Hindi pa po.
Hindi pa. So, the first question is, have we earned fully the income? So, kung hindi pa natin na-earn fully yung income, answer nyo kasi, hindi pa. So, kung hindi pa natin na-earn fully yung income, dapat ba natin i-report yun as full income?
Hindi po.
Hindi po. So a portion of it must be reported as liability.
Liability.
So kapag ni-report natin siya as liability, pagre-record tayo ng unearned revenues. But is there a contract or is there a law stating na kapag hindi mo pa yan na-earn, liability mo yan? Wala. But it is mandated by our accounting practice, which is a normal business practice, since hindi mo pa siya na-earn, kahit na ibayad sa'yo in advance, i-record mo muna yan as liability kasi hindi mo pa naman siya technically na-earn. At technically, yung binigay sa yung cash, hindi pa talaga sa iyo. Kasi dapat ma-earn mo muna yung related income. So, unearned revenues are considered as constructive obligation. Gets po ba, class?
Yes po.
Yes,
Yes.
po.
Okay. Okay, sorry. All right. So, from the terminology ng liability, it is a present obligation arising from past transaction or event. So, if it's a past transaction or past event, dapat nating alamin, meron bang obligating event? Kung may obligating event, then there must be a present obligation. Kasi kung may past transaction at past event, tapos wala namang obligating event, then there is no present obligation. Kung walang present obligation, wala tayong i-record na liability. Nakukuha po ba?
Yes po.
Yes.
Yes
All
po.
right.
Yes po.
So let's go now with financial liability. So anong sinabi ni financial liability, ni IAS 32, financial liability? Anyone from the class? Yes, Danica Joy. Yes,
A financial liability is any liability that is a contractual obligation to deliver cash for another financial asset to another entity, to exchange financial assets or financial liabilities to another entity under conditions that are potentially unfavorable to the entity, that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments and is a non-derivative for which the entity may be obliged, and that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments and is a derivative that will or may be settled other than by exchange of a fixed amount of cash or financial assets for a fixed number of the entity's own equity instruments.
all right. So that's correct. So financial liability, as per IAS 32, it is a contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial assets to the entity, or to exchange financial assets or financial liabilities with another entity under the conditions that are potentially unfavorable to the entity. Ano pa yung sabi? It could be a contract. It could be a contract na ano po? Contract that will or may be settled in the entity's own equity instruments. So that contract could be a non-derivative or a derivative. So na-discuss na natin yung derivative sa non-derivative, di ba? So pag sinabing derivative, it came from another financial instrument na merong naka-embed na derivative. Kaya siya naging derivative financial instruments. And then pag non-derivative, it is just an ordinary financial instrument. Gets po ba, class? Nakukuha po ba yung sinasabi ko? If you have questions, you need to ask me questions para in the future, in case you will encounter or meet another professors, hindi niyo na sila dapat tanungin. Kasi naitanong niyo na sila sa akin. Or in case you want them to ask, i-validate niyo lang. Kung ano yung sinagot ko, dapat pareho kami na isasagot. So, do you have any questions regarding financial liability, class? Any question, class?
None po.
None so far. All right. So, if it's not, kung wala pong question, let's go further with the financial liability. So, sa financial liabilities, sa financial liabilities class, we have to check kung meron bang hello class, can you still hear me?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Yes po.
Okay.
Yes po.
All right, class. Okay. So, sa financial liability, very critical ito kapag i-check natin. So, we have to check first the financial instrument. So, critical features of the financial liability. Bakit kaya merong critical features yung financial liability? Kasi first, it came from a financial instrument. It came from financial instrument. So, kung nanggaling siya from a financial instrument, that means to say, we're not so sure if it's a financial asset or a financial liability or an equity instrument. Pero madali natin matatandaan kung yung financial instrument ay financial asset kasi kapag financial instrument, pag financial asset, that is favorable to the entity. Pero kapag financial liability, that is unfavorable to the entity. So pag financial asset, favorable to the entity. Pag financial liability, unfavorable to the entity. So madali na nating ma-identify if it's a financial asset or a financial liability. Now, the question here is, can we classify or can we identify if it's a financial liability or an equity instrument? Kasi kapag financial liability, there is an outflow. There is a contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial asset to another entity. Yun yung terminology no financial liability. Pero kapag chinek mo din si equity instrument, yun din yung kanyang definition, a contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial assets to the entity. So meaning to say, pareho ng definition si financial liability or an O at si equity instrument. Nakukuha po ba? Nagigets niyo po ba yung yung idea? Kasi 'di ba tapos na kayo sa accounting for nyo, which is corporation. 'Di ba? Kaya nga nasa intermediate accounting na kayo kasi you're done already with the basic accounting. And then nung naalala nyo sa accounting for corporation ninyo, kapag nag-issue ng shares of stocks, which is an equity instrument, di ba pag nag-issue kayo ng shares of stocks, initially makaka-receive kayo ng cash. But in the future, there is a contractual right to deliver cash kasi magbabayad kayo ng dividends. Magbabayad kayo ng cash kapag na-repurchase nyo yung equity instrument in the form of treasury shares. So, naisip niyo po ba na, kung kapag equity instrument, there is a contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial assets in the future sa isa pang entity. Naalala pa po ba yun, class? Can you still hear me, class?
Yes po.
Alright. Malinaw po ba na kapag financial liability unfavorable, kasi meron kang ilalabas na pera or i-issue na another financial instrument or financial asset to another entity?
Yes po, malinaw po.
Yes po.
So, pero kay equity instrument, malinaw din po ba na meron kang contractual obligation to deliver cash in the future or another financial asset to another entity?
Yes po.
Sige, ganito ha. Basic lang to. Para mas maintindihan natin ng husto yung mga susunod nating topic. Kasi di ba pag si corporation, di ba? Corporation A. Si corporation A, meron siyang 100,000 authorized shares. 100,000 authorized shares siya. Ngayon, yung 100,000 authorized shares na yun, na-issue niya. 100,000 issued shares. Meron siyang issued shares. So, kanina niya in-issue? Kay corporation B. Meron kay corporation B, meron kay individual 1, meron kay individual 2, meron kay individual 3, meron corporation C, meron corporation D. So marami siyang pinag-issuehan ng shares of stocks niya. Nakukuha po ba? Nakakasunod po ba lahat?
Yes po.
Yes po.
Alright. So ulitin ko po ha, si Corporation A, meron siyang authorized 100,000 shares. Ilan yung in-issue niya? 100,000. So lahat ng authorized shares niya ay considered as outstanding shares. So kanina niya in-issue lahat yan ng 100,000. Kay Corporation B, Individual 1, Individual 2, Individual 3, Corporation C, Corporation B. So lahat yan, meron silang shares. Pag tinotal mo lahat yon 100,000 shares. Tama po ba? Nagigets po ba?
Yes po.
Yes. In the future,
Yes po.
in the future, magbabayad siya ng cash in the form of dividends, di ba?
Yes po.
So kapag nagbayad siya ng dividends, pumasok po ba siya sa definition niyang contractual obligation to deliver cash? Kasi pwede siyang magbayad ng cash, dividends. Tama po ba?
Opo.
Yes po.
At the same time, pwede siyang mag-issue ng another financial asset to another entity in the form of share options. Pwede pa siya mag-issue ng share warrants. Pwede rin siya mag-issue ng stock dividends. So these are financial instruments. So financial instruments ito. So lumalabas si financial liability saka si si equity instrument, almost the same sila ng definition. So the question here is, paano natin ma-identify kung yung financial instrument ba, is it a financial liability or an equity instrument? Yung class, nakikinig pa po ba? Hey class, can you still hear
Yung
me?
residual value po.
Residual value. The residual value applies. So residual value
Yung what's left po.
applies only if there is a compound financial instrument. We are still not talking about compound financial instrument. We are talking about a financial liability and an equity instrument separately. So identify lang muna natin sila. Ano ba yung pinagkaiba ni financial liability sa ni equity instrument? Kasi pareho sila ng definition as per IAS 32. Ngayon, identify natin bakit at paano natin malalaman na magkaiba sila. Kasi itong residual value applies only if there is a compound financial instrument. That is a combination of a financial liability and then equity instrument. So wala pa tayo doon. Pero thank you for telling that kasi i-discuss din natin yan. Yes, I think Francis Sandra.
Yung financial liability po, namely the user's contractual obligation to pay cash. Pag equity instrument naman po, may choice po yung holder to convert it to common shares po. Bali po yung share niya sa dividend, it's either kukunin niya or i-convert niya sa common shares po.
So, lumalabas si equity instrument has Can you repeat it again?
Si equity instrument, may option po siya na i-convert yung dividends niya into common share po.
To convert into stock dividend, or I think that's within the compound financial instrument. I think that definition applies in a compound financial instrument. Okay, class. So, ganito. I have an assignment. I have an assignment for all of you. So, we can discuss this next meeting. Can you research? Can you research examples of financial liabilities? And then examples of equity instrument. So, assignment. So, give examples of financial liabilities. And then, ikalawa naman, give examples of equity instruments. And then ikatlo, give examples of equity instruments that are classified as financial liabilities. So research lang kayo. So we can discuss this next meeting. So ano yung una? Magbigay kayo ng example ng financial instrument na ang classification financial liabilities. Ikalawa, magbigay kayo ng example ng equity instruments. Ikatlo, magbigay kayo ng example ng equity instrument na ang classification sa accounting ay financial liabilities. Then we will discuss this next meeting.
Sir, tag-ilan po.
Do you have any more question, class?
Sir, ilan pong examples?
Sige, ilan? Wala naman po siya. Wala pong minimum or maximum examples. As many as you can identify, much better. Para it's for the benefit of all. So this will be a combination of assignment at the same time discussion next meeting. Siyempre, if you have your assignment, you can tell it to everyone in the class. Na kasi you have your bala, you have your own bullet na ibabatong mo sa amin na ito yung mga na-research ko, I have this financial liability, they have this. So, as many as you can identify, pwede. So, I can validate if that is correct or hindi. And then malay ba natin, baka merong klase ng financial instrument na hindi ko alam. Diba? So, mas matututunan natin lahat. Do you still have any more question, class? Can you still hear me, class?
Yes po.
All right.
Yes
So
po.
I don't think you still have any more questions. Thank you so much for taking this call, and class dismissed. So see you next meeting next Tuesday. Thank you, class.
you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you po.
Thank you po, sir.
So wait, this coming Friday, I'll send you a handout materials. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye
Thank you
po.
po.
Thank you po.
Thank you po, sir.
Thank you po, sir.